The year 216 BC on the fields of Cannae witnessed the most horrific collapse of 48,200 soldiers. The historian Polybius recorded that, with every passing minute, at least 100 legionaries fell within a death trap. This is not a fairy tale of a giant and a small boy, but a forensic file of a real military catastrophe. On the left bank of the Aufidus River, the elite of Rome believed that their 86,400 troops would crush all resistance. They looked upon the Balearic slingers with contempt, unaware that the kinetic energy of a pebble could be utterly devastating. The muzzle velocity of these handheld slings could reach 160 kilometers per hour, creating a skull-shattering impact. A deadly paradox was emerging as the most primitive weapon prepared to fire at the weak points of a war machine. Look at the map to see how sophisticatedly Hannibal set the stage for this slaughter, exploiting every meter of the Apulian soil. The footsteps of the Roman legions were marching straight into a trap orchestrated by arrogance and precise mechanical calculations. But why would a force twice as large voluntarily crowd itself into death after only a few hours of dubious preliminary skirmishing? The Volturnus wind began to blow fiercely from the southeast, dragging clouds of blinding dust from the dry bed of the Aufidus River directly into the faces of the Roman troops. Through the hazy dust, Consul Varro observed that the Carthaginian formation was not a flat line, but jutted forward in the center like a convex bow. Hannibal had chosen a perilous position right at the peak of that bow, where his least experienced Gallic and Iberian infantry were concentrated. On the flanks of the crescent, elite Libyan heavy infantry, trained in the phalanx mechanism, remained hidden and waiting. The Aufidus River, flowing swiftly on the Roman right flank, inadvertently became a natural wall, blocking any attempt to expand their formation. The distance between the two lines narrowed to less than 800 meters as Varro ordered the maniples to adjust to an incredibly dense combat density. Squares of the Crimson Legions began to move along the vertical axis, creating a terrifying pressure compressing into the heart of the Carthaginian center. Seen from above, the Roman maneuver resembled a giant spearhead trying to pierce a thin but meticulously calculated shell. Thousands of Roman soldiers had to squint against the dust and the brilliant morning sun from the east shining directly onto their heavy scutum shields. The deeper they pushed into the center, the more the Romans believed they were winning, seeing the enemy infantry retreat in a steady rhythm. However, this was no chaotic rout, but a force absorption cycle that Hannibal had meticulously rehearsed beforehand. The Aufidus River now became the trigger for the trap as Hasdrubal's cavalry on the left wing began to accelerate, seizing the northern space. Every meter of Carthaginian retreat meant the combat pocket was shifting from a convex arc into a concave crescent. The Roman flow of manpower continued to be sucked into the widening funnel as lower-ranking officers reported gridlock on both flanks. Doubt began to spread among the rear ranks as they no longer had space to swing their swords or deploy the standard pilum javelins. The troop density at the point of contact rose to unimaginable levels, causing soldiers in the middle to be lifted off the ground by the pressure of their own comrades. Varro's tactic now depended on a single assumption, that Hannibal's center must break before the trap could close. The field map showed that all 8 Roman legions had fallen into a narrow space, barely 1/3 of their original deployment area. Clanging sounds of metal echoed as the Roman vanguard finally clashed with the last line of defense, the Libyan heavy infantry. Yet, while the Romans were preoccupied with pouring all their might into the core, the ghosts of the Numidian cavalry had already completed their fateful rotation on the flanks. While the infantry was being compressed, it was the Balearic slingers who began to demonstrate a terrifying damage mechanism that far surpassed any type of bow and arrow. The structure of the sling consisted merely of 2 leather cords and a pouch, yet the power it generated followed the most brutal laws of physics. By whirling the sling in a centrifugal circle, these marksmen accumulated a massive amount of energy before releasing one cord to launch the projectile. Archaeological data reveals that pebbles or lead bullets weighing about 100 grams were fired with a muzzle velocity of 160 kilometers per hour. Compare the kinetic energy. While a common arrow usually only causes a piercing wound, a stone from a Balearic soldier was equivalent to the blow of a hammer. At an effective range of 200 meters, these stones did not just dent bronze armor, they caused powerful cerebral concussions through the helmets. When the stones targeted the face or limbs areas where Roman armor could not provide full coverage, they turned into instantaneous killing weapons. Unlike the bulky pilum javelins which could only be thrown once, each Balearic slinger carried a pouch of ammunition with the capability to fire 6 continuous shots per minute. This primitive anti-infantry mechanism created an indirect ballistic screen pouring straight into the Roman ranks, who were losing their ability to defend their flanks. Historians recorded that lead bullets could even embed themselves deep into a soldier's body, leaving ancient medics completely helpless to treat them. The power of this $0 weapon lay in the fact that it completely neutralized the advantage of the expensive armor worn by Roman aristocrats and commanding officers. Hannibal precisely calculated the firing tempo to maintain psychological pressure, forcing Roman soldiers to huddle their shields over their heads instead of attacking. This huddling to avoid the rain of stones inadvertently supported the legion's compression mechanism, reducing the contact area and the ability of the frontline infantry to swing their swords. The impact force from the stones created a clattering din against the scutum shields, like an endless meteor shower amidst the Apulian heat. Firepower maps show that the slinger teams always maintained a safe distance at the 2 edges of the crescent to optimize the cross-firing angle into the opposing formation. When a tiny pebble struck down a leading centurion, the entire hand signal communication system of that unit was instantly paralyzed. The paradox at Cannae became clear. Impoverished nomads held the power of life and death over the most elite army in the Mediterranean. Physical parameters confirm that at such high velocities, the human eye could barely react in time to dodge these small gray bullets. Sling bullets did not just kill through open wounds, they broke the will to fight through the fear of a death coming from invisible directions. Carthage's long-range firepower mechanism had completed the task of softening the target before the encirclement closed completely by midday. While the Romans were still preoccupied with fending off the stones falling from the sky, a disastrous order from Varro began to be executed. Amidst the dust and screams, Consul Varro believed that a concentrated steel punch would be the key to ending the battle quickly. He ordered the maniples to close the gaps between units from the standard 5 meters to less than 1.5 meters. This action transformed the Roman legions from flexible, mobile units into a dense, sluggish mass of humanity. According to the movement diagrams of the Roman army, overcompressing the formation completely neutralized the ability to rotate fresh soldiers from the rear ranks. Soldiers in the second and third lines, instead of providing support, inadvertently pushed the vanguard hopelessly into the enemy's blades. Troop density now reached a horrific level, estimated at 4 men per square meter, making it impossible even to turn around or raise a shield. Varro ignored reports that his flanks were exposed, as he was too focused on using sheer mass to crush the center of the Carthaginian crescent. Every Roman step forward was no longer a tactical initiative, but a physical shove from tens of thousands of panicked men behind them. Hannibal stood at the center, smiling as he saw his prey suffocating its own living space, exactly according to the script he had rehearsed. The Roman command mechanism began to fracture as junior officers could not relay orders through the masses packed as tight as wedges. Rear maniples began to lose their orientation, seeing only the backs of their comrades, oblivious to the slaughter occurring at the front line. Tension reached its peak as screams from both flanks began to drown out the clashing of weapons, signaling a disaster taking shape. Commander Varro completely lost control over more than 80 maniple units that were overlapping into a gargantuan mess. Every square meter of soil at Cannae was now a pressure trap, where superior numbers became a 1,000-pound burden on every soldier's shoulders. The movement diagrams show that the more gracefully the Carthaginian center retreated, the more the Roman mass forced itself into a death trap. The flow of Roman manpower was completely choked at the choke point where Hannibal had stationed his most elite Libyan infantry. A terrifying silence fell over the Roman rear ranks as they realized their only retreat route toward the Aufidus River was being threatened. The high noon sun beat down on trembling scutum shields, signaling the fateful hour for the entire Republic. Varro had no idea that Hasdrubal's cavalry had already shattered the Roman right wing and was performing a historic pivot behind him. The double envelopment mechanism was no longer a theory on paper. It was real blades closing in from every direction. Carthage's signal horns sounded one last time, tearing through the dust-filled air and the despair of the Roman legions. Blocks of maniples were squeezed so tight that the bones of the soldiers groaned and snapped under the pressure of their own comrades from behind. The tactical map now clearly showed a crimson circle closing around a blue mass, struggling in total command paralysis. In the most glorious moment of his career, Hannibal ordered the Libyan infantry on both flanks to pivot 90 degrees and slam the bag shut. The ancient world held its breath, realizing that 86,400 men were now merely spectators waiting for their turn to be executed. The moment the trap snapped shut was also when the brutal reality descended, as the two wings of the Libyan infantry simultaneously slammed into the Roman flanks. The double envelopment mechanism was now complete, transforming Hannibal's concave crescent into a gargantuan noose tightening around 8 legions. Every Roman soldier now lacked even the space to breathe, let alone swing a sword or defend themselves with their heavy shields. Hasdrubal's cavalry, after sweeping away the Roman right wing, executed a fateful pivot that locked the cellar door from behind Varro's back. Rome's command system was utterly paralyzed as messengers were crushed within the dense mass of their own troops. The field map now revealed a circle of death where 80,000 human beings were crammed into a space only a few hundred meters wide. The historian Polybius described the scene of Roman soldiers forced to stand still and wait for death, unable to lift their arms amidst the compressed crowd. According to modern military mathematical calculations, the rate of killing at Cannae reached a terrifying figure of over 100 lives per minute. Every passing second was equivalent to 2 lives lost, creating layers of corpses piled so high they obscured the view of the battlefield. Casualty figures surged with every heartbeat as the Carthaginian army began the systematic work of execution from the outer edges. The Numidian cavalry, with their mechanism of continuous flanking strikes, allowed not a single gap for the Romans to escape. The Numidian cavalry, with their mechanism of continuous flanking strikes, allowed not a single gap for the Romans to escape. The harsh afternoon sun of the Apulian region beat down on bronze armor stained with blood, where the elite of Rome was being erased. Consul Aemilius Paulus, despite being heavily wounded early on, still attempted to rally scattered groups, but was helpless against the mechanical pressure. The Roman legions, originally designed for breakthrough attacks, now became victims of the very superior troop density they once took pride in. The compression mechanism caused soldiers in the center to suffocate and die standing, even before facing an enemy blade. The screams of tens of thousands of people driven into a corner echoed throughout the Aufidus River valley like an indictment of arrogance. Hannibal observed from Cannae Hill, watching his war machine operate with millisecond precision, like a piece of clockwork. The historian Livy recorded that thousands of Roman soldiers dug pits in the sand to bury their heads, seeking a quick death in total despair. For 10 continuous hours, the soil of Cannae absorbed the blood of more than 45,000 infantry and 2,700 cavalry. This was no longer a battle, but an industrial killing line where maneuver technique had completely triumphed over raw power. The gold rings of Roman nobles and senators were stripped and piled into great heaps, testifying to the collapse of a ruling class. Maniple units once famous were now merely names on paper, their designations wiped out entirely under the Carthaginian blade. The smell of blood and volturnous dust mixed to create a thick atmosphere, signaling the end of the darkest day in Roman history. The final statistics showed a casualty rate reaching 85%, a level of destruction nearly unprecedented in antiquity. The roughly 14,000 who were lucky enough to escape were merely mental shells after witnessing their comrades being crushed in the combat pocket. Hannibal proved that with a proper pincer mechanism, man can turn superior numbers into their own fatal weakness. The victory at Cannae was not just a military milestone, but a deep psychological scar that would haunt Rome for centuries to come. Amidst the wreckage of the steel legions, the body of Consul Paulus was found lying silently beside nameless soldiers. A stinging question rose from the silent battlefield. Why did the strongest military system in the world collapse before stones and mercenary cavalry? Why did a military system considered the most perfect in the ancient world fail so miserably against armies dismissed as lower class? The answer lies in the spiderweb cracks on the Montefortino bronze helmets recovered from the Cannae archaeological site. Historical forensics reveal these fractures did not come from swords or spears, but from the concentrated impact force of lead bullets and river pebbles. The Roman elite built a system based on rigid discipline and heavy armor, yet they overlooked the lethal flexibility of primitive elements. Hannibal saw through this vulnerability, using cheap Balearic slingers to neutralize high-ranking commanding officers adorned in gold rings. Rome's systemic Achilles heel was the rotating command one general per day, which eliminated consistency when reacting to new variables. Varro's arrogance, rooted in his faith in the sheer mass of 80,000 troops, blinded him to the signs of a double envelopment slowly closing in. While Rome invested in million-dollar armor, Hannibal invested in understanding his opponent's psychology and exploiting harsh terrain. The cracks on the Roman helmets are not just physical evidence, they are symbols of the collapse of a quantity over quality military doctrine. The manipule system, so powerful in frontal assaults, became a prison with no escape once compressed to the point where swords could not be swung. The stones gathered from the bed of the Aufidus River proved that, in war, technology or cost matters less than the operational mechanism. Hannibal transformed a multi-ethnic mercenary force into a unified entity capable of devouring the proudest purebred legions. Archaeological data from mass graves at Cannae confirms a grim reality. Most soldiers died from being trampled and suffocated. The failure of the Roman elite here is a classic lesson in being over-reliant on old values while ignoring the shifting nature of warfare. A system is only as strong as its ability to adapt, yet Rome at Cannae chose a rigidity that caused it to snap under its own weight. Carthage did not win through raw brutality, but by optimizing the cheapest resources to create the maximum destructive efficiency. Every crack on the armor displayed in museums today still tells the story of a day when tactical intellect defeated royal might. The legacy of Cannae lies not in the death toll, but in how it forced Rome to tear down and rebuild its entire military structure. 600 years later, commanders would still shudder at the memory of how Hannibal used stones and cavalry to break the will of a superpower. Yet, even within the ruins of this humiliating defeat, the seeds of vengeance were beginning to quietly take root in the heart of Italy. The battle at Cannae, in 216 BC, left an eternal legacy regarding the optimization of the lowest-cost resources. Hannibal did not need expensive armored legions to rewrite history. Instead, he required an absolute understanding of physical mechanics and human psychology. A single river pebble and a leather sling worth $0 were enough to pierce the pride of a trillion-dollar military system of the ancient world. The greatest lesson from the fields of Apulia is that the flexibility of intellect can always defeat the rigidity of giant steel masses. Rome paid with the blood of 80,000 soldiers to understand that war is not a game of numbers, but the art of contact points. The destruction at Cannae forced the Romans to shed their shell of arrogance and begin the most radical military reform in their history. They learned to listen to the Vulturnus wind, to respect nomadic marksmen, and to study the very way Hannibal had encircled them. This catastrophe did not mark the end of an empire, but the beginning of a new generation of commanders who would carry the blood debt of Cannae for life. Among the survivors who fled the combat pocket that year was a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who swore never to forget this day. 14 years later, it would be Scipio himself standing across from Hannibal on another field called Zama, with a trap even more perfect. The map of history was preparing to turn a new page, where Hannibal's most brilliant student would use his master's own mechanisms to finish Carthage. The paradox of Cannae remains, reminding us that the most primitive things can sometimes hold the power to change the destiny of a nation. The story of the $0 stone that downed the Roman nobility has closed, but it opened a life and death pursuit spanning decades across continents. What did Scipio see within the encirclement of Cannae that allowed him to later break the legend of Hannibal Barca in his own homeland?